He commanded an empire built on blood and silence, but he couldn't get his own son to speak a single word. Andy Park sat rigid in his custom-tailored suit, watching his 9-year-old son, Jackie, rock back and forth in the leather booth of Hanul. The boy's untouched $300 Wagyu beef grew cold, while other diners cast nervous glances their way, not judgment, but fear. They recognized the tattoos peeking from Andy's collar. They knew who he was. Andy's jaw clenched with each whispered word, each frightened stare. "Jackie, please," he muttered in Korean, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You're making me look weak." But then something extraordinary happened. A black waitress approached their table with movements so calm they could quiet storms. Without a word, she knelt beside Jackie's chair and began humming a soft melody, a traditional Korean lullaby that shouldn't have sounded so natural in her voice. But what Andy didn't realize was that she wasn't just surviving. She was about to show him what decades of violence had taught him to forget. Within 3 minutes, the boy who hadn't spoken in 2 years was eating from her hands. Andy stared in shock, his bodyguards exchanging glances. Who was this woman? And how had she done what teams of $10,000 an hour specialists couldn't? 3 days earlier, the private elevator climbed to the penthouse office in silence. Andy Park, head of Seoul's most feared criminal organization, stood like a stone sentinel behind bulletproof windows, watching the city sprawl beneath him like territory he controlled through fear. His empire spanned the underground: drug trafficking, protection rackets, money laundering, 3 industries that touched thousands of lives in the shadows. Yet the one life that mattered most remained unreachable. His lieutenant knocked sharply. "Boss, the car's ready for your dinner with Jackie." Andy closed his eyes. Another obligatory father-son meal. Another evening of sitting across from a child who lived in a world Andy's violence couldn't enter. Across the city, Selene Francis tied her apron strings in the cramped employee break room of Hanul. At 34, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to carry invisible burdens. Her hands bore the scars of double shifts and swallowed dreams, but her eyes held something money couldn't buy, a depth of understanding that came from loving the overlooked, even when the world tried to erase her. She checked her reflection in the scratched mirror. 8 years ago, those same hands had guided over 200 special needs children through breakthrough moments in Seoul. 8 years ago, she'd believed education could change lives. Now she carried plates for Korea's elite and swallowed her rage, one shift at a time. Meanwhile, 9-year-old Jackie Park sat in the back seat of a bulletproof Mercedes, his small hands tracing patterns on the tinted window. The Seoul lights blurred past like stars he could never touch. He lived in a mansion with 12 rooms and armed guards at every entrance, yet spent most of his time in one, his bedroom, where the world felt manageable and sounds didn't stab like knives. The evening started predictably. 3 days earlier, the blood was still being cleaned from Andy Park's office floor when his phone rang. 2 men in surgical gloves worked methodically with bleach and industrial cleaner, erasing evidence of the morning's business meeting. Andy stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Gangnam penthouse office, 48 floors above Seoul, watching the city pulse beneath him like a living organism he'd learned to control through calculated violence. The Han River snaked through the urban sprawl, reflecting afternoon sunlight that never quite reached the shadows where his empire thrived. Drug trafficking through the ports, protection rackets in Itaewon and Hongdae, money laundering through a web of legitimate businesses, restaurants, tech startups, and his personal favorite charitable foundations. The irony never touched him. Charities were perfect covers, vulnerable to takeover, trusted by authorities, and no one questioned where the money really flowed. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it, watching one of the cleaners scrub at a particularly stubborn stain near his mahogany desk. The man who'd left that stain had stolen from him, had thought Andy's recent distraction meant weakness, had learned, in his final moments, that distraction and weakness were not the same thing. The phone rang a 3rd time. Andy's jaw tightened. Only 3 people had this number. He glanced at the screen. Jackie's school. His hand moved to answer before his brain could catch up. some primal instinct overriding years of cultivated coldness. "Mr. Park, this is Principal Kim." The woman's voice carried that particular tone educators reserved for delivering bad news to dangerous parents. Careful, measured, terrified of saying the wrong thing. "There's been another incident with Jackie. He's locked himself in the storage closet and won't come out. We've tried everything, but he's hitting his head against the wall. We can hear it through the door." Andy closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw Jackie at 3 years old, before the diagnosis, laughing as Andy tossed him in the air. Back when touch didn't hurt. Back when the world wasn't too loud, too bright, too much. "I'm sending someone," Andy said, his voice flat. He ended the call and turned to his lieutenant, Min-ho, who stood by the door pretending not to listen. "Go get my son, bring him home." Gently. Min-ho nodded and disappeared. The cleaners finished their work and left without a word, taking their supplies and their silence with them. Andy stood alone in his spotless office. No evidence, no witnesses, no consequences. He controlled everything in this city that mattered, except the one thing that mattered most. Across the city, in a studio apartment barely large enough for a bed and a table, Selene Francis pulled her hair back into a tight bun and checked her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. 34 years old. Dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide anymore. Hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and too much coffee. She reached into the drawer beside her sink and pulled out a folder she hadn't opened in months. Inside, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, was her Columbia University PhD certificate, special education with distinction. Below it, letters of recommendation from professors who'd called her transformative and essential. Job offers from prestigious institutions in 3 countries, a life that felt like someone else's fever dream. She closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer, burying it beneath spare toiletries and forgotten receipts. That woman, Dr. Selene Francis, director of the Seoul Special Needs Alliance, was dead. Had died 4 years ago when the funding collapsed, when the visa complications started, when the world decided her expertise was worth less than her ability to carry plates, without dropping them. Now she was just Selene, waitress at Hanul, one of Seoul's most exclusive restaurants. She tied her crisp white apron and grabbed her bus pass. The late shift started in 40 minutes, and being late meant being fired, and being fired meant deportation, and deportation meant... what? Going back to where? She'd spent 8 years building a life in Seoul. 8 years helping over 200 children find their voices, their confidence, their place in a world that wanted to categorize them as broken. She locked her apartment and descended 4 flights of stairs. The elevator had been broken for 3 weeks. Into the autumn Seoul afternoon. The sun was setting early now, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. On the bus, packed shoulder to shoulder with other invisible workers, she closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her unbidden. 8 years ago, she'd stood in a bright classroom in Gangnam, surrounded by 15 children whose parents had been told they'd never learn, never communicate, never thrive. She'd proven every single prognosis wrong, had developed programs that other countries wanted to replicate, had believed, with the naive certainty of someone who'd never watched their life's work crumble, that love and expertise could change the world. The bus lurched to a stop. Selene opened her eyes and stepped into the street, letting the crowd carry her toward Hanul's employee entrance. Inside, the kitchen was already chaos. Chefs barking orders in rapid Korean, servers rushing past with trays held high. She clocked in, checked her section assignment, and became invisible again. Meanwhile, across the city in Seongbuk-dong, 9-year-old Jackie Park sat in the back of a bulletproof Mercedes S-Class, his small fingers tracing endless patterns on the tinted window. The driver, one of his father's men who'd been briefed to stay quiet and drive smoothly, navigated Seoul's evening traffic with practiced care. Jackie watched the city lights begin to flicker on, each one a small explosion of sensory input his brain couldn't quite process correctly. too bright. Too many. The patterns they made as the car moved were almost soothing, though. Lines becoming curves, becoming lines again. A rhythm his mind could follow when nothing else made sense. He lived in a mansion with 12 rooms, each more spacious than most Seoul apartments. But Jackie knew only one room intimately. His bedroom, where his father had installed blackout curtains and sound-dampening panels, where the thermostat stayed at exactly 21 degrees Celsius, where every texture and surface had been carefully chosen to not hurt. The rest of the house was foreign territory, the kitchen with its clattering pots, the living room with its echoing marble floors, his father's office, where men came and went, and sometimes there were sounds Jackie's mind couldn't categorize, sounds that made his father's voice go hard and cold in a way that scared him more than the loudness itself. The Mercedes pulled through the mansion's gates, wrought iron topped with security cameras. Minho had picked him up from school with unusual gentleness, hadn't asked questions about the storage closet or the bruise forming on Jackie's forehead where he'd banged it against the wall trying to make the noise stop, had simply buckled him into the car and driven him home to safety. But safety felt hollow when you couldn't explain why everything hurt. When your mother looked at you after the diagnosis and couldn't hide the disappointment in her eyes. When she'd left for Los Angeles 3 months later, her last words to your father sharp enough to cut through the door. "I didn't sign up for this. I didn't sign up for a broken child." Jackie wasn't broken. He knew he wasn't. But he also couldn't make his father understand why food textures felt like swallowing glass. Why sounds other people barely noticed felt like ice picks in his skull. Why eye contact felt like staring into the sun. The car stopped. Minho opened the door and waited patiently for Jackie to emerge in his own time, one of the few men in his father's organization who'd learned that rushing made everything worse. Jackie climbed out and walked toward the house, toward his room, toward the only space in this enormous mansion that felt like it belonged to him. Behind the walls, his father's empire churned with violence and money and power that touched thousands of lives. But none of that power could reach into Jackie's world and make it gentler. None of that money could buy him 5 minutes of peace in a classroom. None of that control could control the way his own mind experienced the world. And somewhere across the city, putting on a practiced smile for customers who'd never know her name, a woman who'd once changed 200 lives prepared for another shift of invisible survival. Their worlds had not yet collided, but in 3 days, in a restaurant neither of them chose, everything would change. The contrasts were absolute. Violence and vulnerability, criminal wealth and working poverty, power and powerlessness, armor and authenticity. 2 people who'd lost everything that mattered, and 1 child who held the key to unlocking what both of them had forgotten how to see. Listen, I spent weeks researching this story. I interviewed people. I cried writing it. And right now, you're hooked. I can tell. But if you don't hit subscribe right now, you'll forget. The next story that might make you see the world differently will pass you by. 2 seconds. Subscribe, because stories that feel this real don't come often. The evening air carried the first bite of winter as Andy Park's convoy pulled up to Hanyul. 2 black Mercedes sedans, windows tinted dark enough to be illegal, but no one would dare pull them over. 4 bodyguards emerged first, 2 positioning themselves at the restaurant's entrance, 2 staying with the vehicles. Minho opened the rear door and Andy stepped out, Jackie's small hand swallowed in his tattooed grip. The boy was already tensing. Andy could feel it in the way Jackie's fingers went rigid, in the almost imperceptible rocking that started before they even reached the door. He tightened his hold. Not cruelly, but firmly. Control the situation, show no weakness. These were the rules that kept him alive in his world. Surely they applied to fatherhood too. Inside Hanyul, the maitre d' bowed deeply, too deeply, fear disguised as respect. "Mr. Park, your usual table is ready." He led them through the main dining room where conversations died mid-sentence. Other diners recognized the tattoos crawling up Andy's neck. Recognized the bodyguard's stance, recognized power when it walked past them. They looked away quickly, the way Soul had learned to look away from things that could hurt them. Andy's usual table was in the back corner, strategic positioning with clear sightlines to both exits, walls protecting his back. Jackie slid into the booth and immediately covered his ears. The restaurant's ambient music, meant to be soothing, was already too much, the soft clink of silverware on plates. The whispered conversations bouncing off marble floors, all of it assaulting his son's senses like physical blows. A server approached. Young, Korean, terrified. She took Andy's order without making eye contact. The usual for me, for the boy. He glanced at Jackie, who was rocking now, hands pressed hard against his ears. Bring rice, plain, and soup, not too hot. The server bowed and retreated. Around them, other diners tried not to stare at the child having a meltdown in Seoul's most exclusive restaurant. Andy felt their judgment like insects crawling on his skin. His jaw clenched. In boardrooms, in back alleys, in the blood-soaked corners of his empire, he commanded absolute respect. But here, in this overpriced dining room, his own son made him look powerless. "Jackie," he said in Korean, his voice low and tight. "Jackie, look at me." The boy didn't look. Never looked. His eyes stayed fixed on some point in the middle distance, his small body rocking in a rhythm Andy had never learned to understand. The food arrived. Wagyu beef for Andy, $300 per plate, cooked to perfection. For Jackie, a bowl of plain white rice and clear broth. The boy didn't touch it. Wouldn't touch it. His hands stayed locked over his ears, his rocking intensified. Andy reached for his son's wrist, tried to guide his hand toward the spoon. Jackie flinched away, a small sound of distress escaping his throat. Around them, whispers grew louder. Andy felt his control slipping, felt the familiar rage building in his chest. Not at Jackie, never at Jackie, but at his own helplessness. At the universe's cruel joke of giving him power over everything except this. "Jackie, please," he muttered through clenched teeth. "People are watching. You're making me look weak." The words hung in the air, bitter and useless. Jackie rocked harder. Then she appeared. Andy didn't see her approach. His focus was too narrowed on his son's distress. But suddenly, there was a woman kneeling beside Jackie's chair. Her movements so fluid and gentle they seemed to create a pocket of calm in the chaos. She was black, which was unusual enough in Seoul to make Andy's bodyguards tense. She wore Hanul's standard white server uniform, but something in the way she carried herself suggested this was a costume, not an identity. Without a word, without asking permission, she knelt at Jackie's eye level. The posture was submissive, non-threatening, and something in Andy's predatory instincts recognized the tactical brilliance of it. She wasn't towering over Jackie like every other adult in his life. She was meeting him where he lived. She began to hum. The melody was Half Moon, Bandel, a traditional Korean lullaby Andy's own mother had sung to him before she died, before his father taught him that songs were weakness. But this woman's version was different. She'd shifted it to a minor key, slowed the tempo, and somehow, impossibly, she'd matched it to the exact rhythm of Jackie's rocking. The boy's hand slowly lowered from his ears. Celine, though Andy didn't know her name yet, picked up the spoon from Jackie's untouched bowl. But she didn't try to feed him. Instead, she moved the spoon in slow circles, the same pattern Andy had seen Jackie trace on windows, on tables, on every surface his hands could reach. She made the food dance, turned dinner into a quiet ballet only his son could see. Jackie's darting eyes, which never stayed still, never focused, found hers. And she didn't flinch, didn't look away. Just held his gaze with a steadiness that somehow didn't demand or threaten. She brought the spoon closer, still moving it in those circular patterns. Jackie leaned forward, his mouth opened. He ate, one bite, then another, then another. His small body began to relax, the tension melting from his shoulders as he followed the rhythm she'd created. The restaurant sounds were still there. The music, the conversations, the clinking silverware. But somehow her presence had built a bubble of safety around him. A space where the world didn't hurt quite so much. Andy stared in shock. His heart was pounding in a way it hadn't since his first kill, since the first time he'd had to choose between violence and death. Across the table, his bodyguards exchanged glances. They'd accompanied Andy to dozens of specialists, watched him spend thousands of dollars per hour on experts who'd tried everything. Behavioral therapy, occupational therapy, medications that left Jackie drowsy and distant but no more connected. And this woman, this server whose name he didn't know, had done in 3 minutes what none of them could do in 3 years. Who was she? Jackie ate half the bowl of rice, more than he'd eaten in a single sitting in weeks. The woman continued humming softly, adjusting her melody whenever his body tensed, matching him, breath for breath, movement for movement. She wasn't forcing him to adapt to her world, she was stepping into his. Can we just stop for a second? If your chest is tight right now, you get why I can't stop telling stories like this. Real pain, real love, real sacrifice. If you value content that doesn't numb you, hit subscribe. Because stories that remind us what it means to care are fading fast. Don't let the real ones disappear. When Jackie finally sat back, exhausted but calm, the woman carefully set down the spoon. She didn't try to touch him, didn't ruffle his hair or pat his shoulder the way people always did, always crossing boundaries he couldn't defend. She simply smiled, a gentle, knowing smile, and rose from her kneeling position with the grace of someone whose knees had memorized that particular motion through countless repetitions. "Thank you," Andy said in English, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. He didn't thank people, didn't show gratitude. Gratitude implied debt, and debt was weakness. The woman met his eyes for the first time. Hers were dark, deep, and held something that money couldn't buy, a recognition of suffering that came from intimate knowledge, not distant sympathy. "He's not difficult," she said quietly in perfect Korean, her accent unmistakably American, but her grammar flawless. "He's just speaking a language most people haven't learned yet." Then she was gone, moving back into the flow of servers with the same fluid grace she'd approached with. Andy watched her disappear into the kitchen, his mind racing through possibilities. A specialist moonlighting as a server? Someone from Jackie's past? But Jackie had no past beyond the parade of expensive failures. His lieutenant leaned in. "Boss, should I find out everything about her?" Andy said, his voice harder than he'd intended. "Everything." But even as Minho pulled out his phone to make calls, to activate the network of informants and surveillance that made up Andy's eyes in the city, Andy felt something shift in his chest. A crack in the armor he'd built over 20 years of survival. A fissure that let in light and air and something dangerously close to hope. Jackie was picking at his rice now, using his fingers to arrange the grains in patterns. Not eating anymore, but calm, present. His eyes occasionally darted toward the kitchen where the woman had disappeared, as if part of him recognized that something impossible had just happened. Around them, the restaurant had resumed its normal rhythm. Diners returned to their conversations. The fear that Andy's presence inspired had settled back into comfortable wariness. But Andy couldn't settle, couldn't return to the cold calculation that usually filled the space between his heartbeats. Something was beginning, something he couldn't control with violence or money or fear, something that terrified him more than any rival gang or police investigation ever had. Because for the first time in his son's life, someone had reached him. And Andy Park, who controlled souls underground with an iron fist, who'd built an empire on other men's fear, who'd survived his father's brutality by becoming harder than stone, had no idea how she'd done it. He signaled for the check, his mind already working through scenarios. He'd find out who she was, would ensure she was always assigned to his table, would pay her whatever it took. Because Jackie had eaten, had been calm, had, for 3 miraculous minutes, seemed almost happy. The money hit his account with the weight of blood and broken bones. But for the first time in years, Andy wondered if perhaps the most valuable thing in Seoul couldn't be bought or threatened into existence. Perhaps it could only be given freely by someone who knew what it meant to be unseen. 10 years ago, Andy Park was 24 and learning what his hands could do. His father, Dae-jung, stood over him in the basement of their Seongbuk-dong house, the house that would later become Jackie's prison of safety, and watched his son beat a man who'd stolen from their organization. "Harder," Dae-jung said in Korean, his voice carrying the flatness of someone who'd said these words 1,000 times before. He needs to understand. They all need to understand. Andy's knuckles were already split, blood mixing, his and the other man's. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. His father's lesson had been clear since childhood. Emotion is weakness, control is survival, and love will get you killed faster than any bullet. The Korean mob didn't forgive softness, didn't forgive hesitation. The man on the floor stopped moving. Andy's father nodded, satisfied. "Good, you're ready." Ready for what? Ready to inherit an empire built on violence? Ready to trade his humanity for power? But Andy didn't ask these questions. Questions were weakness too. He simply washed the blood from his hands and stepped into the role his father had carved for him since birth. Over the next 6 years, he built his empire meticulously, expanded beyond his father's territory in ways the old man had never imagined. While Dae-jung relied on brutality alone, Andy understood that modern organized crime required modern infrastructure. He diversified: drug trafficking through Busan ports, protection rackets in the nightclub districts, and his personal innovation, money laundering through legitimate businesses. Tech startups were perfect. So much capital flowing through them, so many investors willing to look the other way for returns. But even better were the charities. Foundations, nonprofits, grant-funded programs. They were vulnerable to takeover, trusted by authorities, and nobody questioned where charitable donations really went. They were legitimate-looking, respectable covers for an empire built on blood. 8 years ago, while Andy was perfecting his laundering operations, Celine Francis stood in a bright classroom in Gangnam, her heart full of possibility. The Seoul Special Needs Alliance occupied the 3rd floor of a modern building near Gangnam Station, accessible, well-funded, and full of the kind of hope that comes from watching impossible things become possible. "Remember," she told her assistant teacher, a young Korean woman named Ji-won, "they're not broken, they're not problems to solve, they're just children who experience the world differently than we do." 15 children filled her classroom that day, ranging from 5 to 12 years old, all of them carrying diagnoses that their parents had been told meant limitation: autism, ADHD, sensory processing disorders, developmental delays, labels that were meant to explain but often just became boxes that trapped potential. Celine had spent 4 years building the Seoul Special Needs Alliance from nothing, had arrived in Seoul at 26 with a master's degree from Seoul National University, fluent Korean learned from her college roommate, and a bone-deep conviction that every child deserved to be seen truly. The program had started with grant funding from the Seoul metropolitan government and private donors, enough to rent space and hire a small staff. Within 3 years, they were helping over 200 children. Celine had developed programs that other countries wanted to replicate: sensory integration therapy combined with cultural understanding of Korean family dynamics, individualized learning plans that respected rather than corrected, parent education that centered dignity instead of normalization. She'd built a sanctuary, a place where different minds weren't deficits to fix but gifts to unwrap. Among her students were children from all over Seoul. Wealthy Gangnam families whose children didn't fit the prestigious academy's molds. Working-class families from Seongbuk-dong and Nowon who'd saved for months to afford even reduced-rate services. She never turned anyone away. Money, she believed, shouldn't determine which children got to thrive. She didn't know that some of those working-class families in Seongbuk-dong lived in territory controlled by a rising young mobster named Andy Park. Didn't know that her programs were helping children whose parents paid protection money to his organization. The criminal underworld and her world of educational idealism existed in the same city but different universes, until they collided. 6 years ago, Andy's financial advisor presented him with a new opportunity. "Boss, there's a network of small nonprofits and charities across Seoul, grant-funded mostly. They're perfect for what we need. Regular cash flows, trusted by authorities, and vulnerable to quiet takeover." Andy reviewed the list. Youth programs, homeless shelters, educational foundations. Among them, the Seoul Special Needs Alliance. He didn't read the details, didn't care about their missions or the people they served, just saw numbers, cash flow projections, risk assessments. "Take them," he said, signing the papers that would route money through these organizations, mixing criminal profits with legitimate grants until no one could tell which was which. All of them. His father would have been proud. Dae-jung had always said the smartest criminals hid in plain sight, used society's goodwill as camouflage. Andy had perfected it. By the time he was 30, his empire was nearly untouchable, too diversified to dismantle, too legitimate-looking to prosecute. 4 years ago, everything collapsed. Not for Andy. His empire survived, even thrived. But the Seoul Metropolitan Government's Anti-Corruption Task Force had been investigating charity fraud for 18 months. They'd traced suspicious money flows through several nonprofits, including the Seoul Special Needs Alliance. The investigators didn't find proof that the alliance's directors were involved. Found no evidence that Celine Francis or her staff knew their grant funding had been mixed with laundered criminal proceeds. But it didn't matter. The contamination was enough. Government grants were immediately suspended pending investigation. Private donors withdrew, terrified of association. Banks froze accounts. The Seoul Special Needs Alliance shut down within 3 months. Celine stood in her empty classroom on a Tuesday morning in November, boxes of files and therapy materials stacked around her. 200 children lost their services overnight. Families who depended on her programs were left scrambling for alternatives that didn't exist or couldn't afford. Years of carefully built trust with parents, with educators, with the community. Gone. And her visa status, which had been tied to her employment, suddenly became complicated. Without a sponsoring employer, she had 90 days to find new work or leave the country. But her reputation had been destroyed by association. Other programs wouldn't hire her, afraid of the taint. Prestigious universities that had courted her for faculty positions went silent. She'd spent 8 years building a life in Seoul. 8 years loving this city's children, learning its streets, becoming part of its fabric. And now she was being erased, victim of a system she'd never known she was entangled with. The restaurant job at Hanul came through a former parent's connection, someone who believed in her, who knew she'd done nothing wrong. It was meant to be temporary. Just until she could find something in her field again. That was 4 years ago. 2 years ago, Andy's world shifted in a different way. His wife, Min-jung, sat across from him in their mansion's dining room, the same mansion where Jackie would later find sanctuary in a single bedroom, and delivered news that should have been joyous. "He's been diagnosed," she said, her voice tight. "Autism spectrum disorder. Severe. The doctor says he'll need intensive support. Special programs." Andy had sat very still, the way he sat still before violence, processing, his son, his only child, broken. Except the doctor had carefully said different, not broken, and Min-jung had cut him off. "Don't give me that inclusive nonsense, I know what this means." She'd looked at Jackie, who was playing in the corner, arranging toy cars in elaborate patterns that made sense only to him. Looked at him, the way Andy's father had once looked at him when he'd cried over his mother's death, with disgust thinly veiled as disappointment. "I didn't sign up for this," she'd said quietly. "I didn't marry you to raise a damaged child. I'm leaving." And she had. 3 months later, divorce papers filed from Los Angeles, custody freely relinquished. She'd wanted out more than she'd wanted their son. Had chosen the promise of a perfect life over the reality of the beautiful, complex child she'd given birth to. Andy had tried everything. Threw money at the problem the way he threw money at every problem. Private specialists, behavioral therapy, occupational therapy, medications that made Jackie drowsy but no more connected. He researched programs, flying in experts from Tokyo, from Singapore, from anywhere that promised hope. But Seoul's resources for families like his were limited. The best programs had waiting lists years long. The affordable programs didn't exist. Had shut down, he learned, due to funding issues and corruption investigations. He never connected the dots, never realized that the charity fraud his organization had perfected years ago had destroyed the very infrastructure his son needed. The irony was perfect and devastating. While Andy was signing papers to launder money through the Seoul Special Needs Alliance, Celine was in that same building helping children just like Jackie. While his criminal enterprise was mixing blood money with legitimate grants, she was developing programs that could have changed his son's life. He'd destroyed what he needed, while building what he thought would protect him. Now, in the present, sitting in Hanul restaurant with his bodyguards stationed at the exits, Andy watched the black waitress disappear into the kitchen and felt the first tremors of understanding without yet knowing what he was understanding. Felt his armor crack without knowing what would pour through the fissure. Jackie was calm, was eating, was, for the first time in memory, not in visible pain. And somewhere in that kitchen, a woman who'd lost everything she'd built was tying her apron and returning to serve customers who'd never know what she'd once been capable of, who'd never know that her expertise had just saved a child whose father's organization had destroyed her life's work. The past and present had collided in a moment of impossible gentleness, but neither of them knew yet. Neither understood that the woman who'd just performed a miracle was the same woman Andy's empire had erased. That the boy who'd finally found peace was the son of the man who'd destroyed her sanctuary. The truth would come later, in a courtroom, in front of cameras and judges and the weight of public judgment. But for now, there was only this: a child eating, a father's cracking armor, and a woman who'd refused to let the world's cruelty steal her ability to see truly. Sometimes the most devastating ironies take years to reveal themselves. Sometimes the person you destroyed is the only one who can save you. And sometimes redemption begins in the space between what we've done and what we could become. If only we had the courage to stop hiding behind our armor long enough to see what we've really been destroying all along. The following Tuesday, Andy's convoy pulled up to Hanul at exactly 7 o'clock. The maitre d' had received a call 3 hours earlier. Mr. Park would be dining with his son, and he requested the server from last week. The black woman. No, they didn't have her name. Yes, it was urgent. No, there would be consequences for confusion. Celine was folding napkins in the break room when the manager found her, his expression caught between opportunity and concern. Table 12. The Park party. They asked for you specifically. She felt her stomach tighten. She'd gone home after that first night and searched the name: Park Enterprises, Andy Park, Seongbuk-dong. The news articles had made her hands shake. Money laundering, suspected drug trafficking, connections to organized crime that prosecutors couldn't quite prove, but everyone knew existed. The kind of man her mother had warned her about, continents away and decades ago. Men who smiled while their hands were still bloody. But she'd also seen his face when Jackie ate. Seen the crack in his armor, the desperate hope of a father watching his child do something impossible. Love looked the same in every language, wore the same expression on every face, even faces that belonged to monsters. "Tell him I'll be right there," she said. This time, Andy had only 2 bodyguards inside, positioned more discreetly near the bar. He'd made an effort, she realized, trying to make the space less threatening for Jackie, even if he didn't quite understand why it mattered. The boy was already rocking when she approached, his small hands covering his ears against the restaurant's ambient noise. "Good evening," Selene said in Korean, keeping her voice low and even. She didn't bow as deeply as the other servers did. Some instinct told her that excessive deference would feel like mockery to a man who commanded it everywhere else. Should I bring the same as last time? Andy nodded, his eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that would have been threatening if it wasn't so obviously confused. He was trying to understand what she'd done, how she'd reached his son. Trying to reverse engineer a miracle through sheer force of will. The food came. Jackie wouldn't eat. Selene knelt beside his chair. Her knees were going to hate her for this, already protesting the repeated impact against hard restaurant floors, and began humming Half Moon again. This time she added something new. She picked up Jackie's hand, gently, and traced the circular pattern he'd been making on the table. Showed him that she saw it, understood it, valued it. Jackie's eyes found hers. He ate. When she stood to leave, Andy's voice stopped her. How did you know to do that? Not a demand. A question. Genuine. Almost vulnerable. Selene looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time. Saw the expensive suit that couldn't hide the tattoos creeping up his neck. Saw the controlled violence in how he held himself. The way a weapon holds itself even at rest. But also saw the exhaustion around his eyes, the desperate confusion of a man who controlled everything except the thing that mattered most. Lower your voice when you talk to him, she said quietly. You're used to commanding. He needs inviting. Andy blinked. What? Your voice. You use it like a weapon because that's what works in your world. But Jackie experiences sound differently. When you talk to him like you're giving orders, it's overwhelming. Try speaking softer, like you're sharing a secret, not issuing a command. She walked away before he could respond, back to her other tables, back to the invisibility that kept her safe. But she could feel his eyes on her, could sense him processing this information like intelligence from an unexpected source. The next week, he came again. And the week after that. By the fourth visit, the other servers had stopped trying to hide their whispers. Some spoke in fear. Everyone in Seoul knew the park name, knew what it meant. Others spoke in racism thinly veiled as concern. Why does he keep requesting her? What's she doing with that gangster, that poor child, being raised by criminals and foreigners? Selene heard all of it. Let it wash over her like rain that couldn't touch what was underneath. She'd survived worse than whispers. During the fifth dinner, she taught Andy something new. Approach him from the side, not head-on. Frontal approach feels threatening to him. It's too direct, too confrontational. Come at him from an angle. Let him see you in his peripheral vision first. Andy practiced right there, moving around the table in a way that must have looked absurd. Seoul's most feared mob boss taking instructions from a waitress on how to approach his own son. But it worked. Jackie didn't flinch when Andy sat back down. Didn't tense. Actually leaned slightly toward his father. Match his patterns, Selene said another night, watching Andy try futilely to get Jackie to stack blocks the right way. He's making something that makes sense to him. You're trying to control it, force it into your structure. What if you joined his structure instead? What if control became conversation? Andy looked at her like she'd spoken in a language he was only beginning to recognize existed. But he tried. Awkwardly, stiffly, he began stacking blocks in the pattern Jackie was making, not correcting, but participating. Jackie's face lit up in a way Selene suspected his father had rarely seen. Each lesson challenged everything Andy had built his identity on. His world ran on dominance, on forcing reality to bend to his will through violence or money or fear. But Jackie needed gentleness, needed surrender, needed his father to enter his world instead of demanding he enter his father's. Let him control the pace, Selene said during their 7th dinner together. You're used to dominating every situation, dictating the speed and terms. But with Jackie, you need to surrender that. Let him move at his speed. Let him decide when he's ready to engage. I don't surrender. Andy said automatically, his voice hard. Celine met his eyes. Then you'll keep losing him. The words hung between them, sharp enough to cut. Andy's jaw clenched. And for a moment she saw the violence in him surface, the predator who'd survived by never backing down, never showing weakness. But then he looked at Jackie, who was humming softly to himself, lost in his own world. And something in Andy's expression cracked further. "Show me," he said quietly. "Show me how to surrender." By the 8th week, something had shifted. Jackie smiled when he saw Celine approach, reached for her hand without prompting. And one evening, as she knelt beside him with his dinner, he said something that changed everything. "Celine Yama," he whispered. "Celine, Mom." The restaurant went quiet. Or maybe it just felt that way, the whole world narrowing to this one moment of impossible connection. Celine's eyes burned with tears she couldn't shed in front of customers. Andy stared at his son, his face a war between pride and something that looked dangerously like grief. Jackie had never called Minjung Iyama with that much warmth, had never reached for her the way he reached for this woman who'd appeared in their lives, like an answer to a prayer Andy hadn't known how to pray. Their connection deepened over the following weeks, but Celine felt the danger growing alongside it. She'd recognized Andy's organization from the news, Park Enterprises, the name that came up in articles about charity fraud investigations. The same investigations that had destroyed the Seoul Special Needs Alliance, the same investigation that had cost her everything. She should hate him, should refuse to help him, should take some bitter satisfaction in watching him struggle with the consequences of a system he'd helped create. But when she looked at Jackie, she saw only a child who needed what she could give. And when she looked at Andy, she saw a man genuinely trying to learn a language he'd spent his whole life being taught didn't exist. She was torn between worlds, between the man who was learning to be gentle with his son and the organization that had destroyed her life's work. Between the love she could see in his eyes when he looked at Jackie and the violence she knew lived in his hands. But complications were brewing beyond her internal conflict. The restaurant owner, Mr. Cho, called her into his office after the 10th dinner. He sat behind his desk with the careful neutrality of a man navigating dangerous waters. "Ms. Francis, I need to ask you about your arrangement with Mr. Park." Celine kept her expression blank. "I serve his table. That's my job." "Yes, but he requests you specifically, every week. For 3 months now." Mr. Cho's fingers drummed on his desk. "I have no problem with this normally, but I need you to understand. My restaurant has connections, business relationships that require careful balance." He didn't say it directly, but Celine heard it anyway. Mr. Cho had connections to rival organizations, the kind of connections that made Andy Park's regular presence complicated. The kind that made his apparent attachment to one particular server even more complicated. "I'm just helping with his son," Celine said carefully. "The boy has special needs. I have experience with—" "I know what you have experience with," Mr. Cho interrupted gently. "I know about the Seoul Special Needs Alliance. I know who you were before you came here. That's why I hired you." He paused. "But I also know who Mr. Park is. And I know that when people like him form attachments, it creates complications." "Are you asking me to refuse his table?" "I'm asking you to be careful, for your own sake, and for mine." Celine left his office with her stomach churning. She'd been careful her whole life. Careful as a Black woman in predominantly Korean spaces. Careful as an immigrant with precarious visa status. Careful as someone who'd already lost everything once and couldn't afford to lose what little she'd rebuilt. But Jackie had called her Iyama, and Andy was learning to approach his son from the side, to lower his voice, to surrender control. And for the first time in 4 years, Celine felt like her expertise mattered again. Like she was using her gifts for what they'd always been meant for. Outside the restaurant, Korean media had started to notice. A photographer caught Andy and Jackie leaving one evening, Selene visible in the background through the restaurant's windows. The photo made it to a gossip blog. Notorious Park spotted at Hanul with son. Who is the mysterious server? The questions were just beginning. The storm was gathering on the horizon, dark clouds of scandal and judgment and violence that neither of them could see yet. But in the eye of that approaching storm, there was this: a child learning to trust, a father learning to surrender, and a woman remembering what it felt like to change lives. Sometimes the most dangerous things we do are the ones that matter most. Sometimes connection is worth the risk of destruction, and sometimes, in trying to save one child, we step onto a path that will force us to face everything we've been running from. The past wasn't done with them yet, but neither of them knew that the woman teaching the father was the same woman his empire had destroyed. That recognition would come later in fire and revelation, and the kind of truth that burns everything down so something new can grow. For now, there was just this: Selene Aoma. And it was enough to keep them both coming back, week after week, despite the whispers and the danger and the growing sense that they were building something too fragile to survive in either of their worlds. The first headline appeared on a Thursday morning in January, splashed across Seoul's most notorious tabloid website: Mafia boss's Waitress mystery, Park's secret family. The photo was grainy but unmistakable. Andy and Jackie leaving Hanul, Selene holding the door, her hand resting briefly on Jackie's shoulder. The angle made it look intimate, familial, scandalous. By that afternoon, the Korean media had picked it up. The story spread like fire through dry grass. Seoul's most notorious gangster, his autistic son, and a black waitress who seemed to have unusual influence over both of them. The racism came quickly, thinly veiled as concern. Black woman raising gangster's son? Read one headline. Foreign influence in Park crime family? Read another. The comment sections were worse. Korean nationalism mixed with anti-black rhetoric, creating a toxic storm of speculation and hatred. Some called Selene a gold digger. Others called her worse things that made her hands shake when she scrolled through them late at night in her studio apartment. A few voices tried to defend her, pointing out that she was just doing her job, but they were drowned out by the majority who'd already decided she was either a victim or a villain, never just a person. Selene stopped reading the comments, but she couldn't escape the stares at work, the way other servers avoided her in the break room, the customers who requested different sections. Mr. Cho called her into his office again. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could see he meant it. "But I need to ask you to take some time off, just until this blows over." "Unpaid time off," Selene clarified. "I don't have a choice. The attention is affecting business. I have investors concerned about the restaurant's reputation." "Of course." She kept her voice even, professional, even though inside she was calculating how long her savings would last, what she could cut from her already minimal budget. "I understand." She didn't understand, but understanding wasn't required for survival. The storm gathered speed. Paparazzi started camping outside Hanul. Reporters called her phone. She never answered, but they left voicemails asking for interviews, offering money for her side of the story. Immigration authorities sent a letter requesting she come in to verify her visa status, a routine check that felt anything but routine, given the timing. Then, everything exploded. It was a Tuesday evening. Andy had texted her. They'd exchanged numbers by then, ostensibly so she could advise him on Jackie's care, asking if she could meet them for dinner. Not at Hanul. The media attention had made that impossible. A different restaurant in Gangnam, quieter, with a private room. Selene had hesitated. The professional boundaries she'd tried to maintain were already blurring, already causing complications she couldn't afford. But Jackie needed consistency. Needed her. So she'd agreed. They met at the restaurant. Jackie ran to her. Actually ran. Something he rarely did in public spaces, and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Selene Yama." His voice was clearer now, stronger. 3 months of consistent connection had worked small miracles. Celine looked up to find Andy watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between gratitude and grief, and a longing so deep it seemed to pull at the air around him. They ate in the private room. Andy was learning. He approached Jackie from the side now, kept his voice low, matched his son's patterns instead of trying to control them. Watching him try to be gentle despite every instinct screaming for dominance was like watching someone learn to write with their non-dominant hand, awkward, uncertain, but determined. After dinner, as they left through the restaurant's back entrance to avoid photographers, everything went wrong. 3 men materialized from the shadows of the parking garage. They moved with the practiced coordination of professionals, not random muggers, but operatives. One went for Jackie while the other 2 blocked Andy's bodyguards. Celine's training kicked in before her fear could. She pulled Jackie behind her, her body becoming a shield, her mind already calculating exits and defensive positions. But she didn't need to. Andy moved like violence made flesh. The transformation was instant and absolute. The man who'd been learning to be gentle with his son became something else entirely. A predator unleashed, a weapon deployed. He broke the first man's arm with a movement too fast to follow. The second man pulled a knife. Andy disarmed him and used his own blade to open a gash across his face that would scar forever. The third man made the mistake of reaching for Jackie. Andy's response was savage. He didn't just stop the threat, he obliterated it. By the time his bodyguards had subdued the first 2 attackers, Andy had the third man on the ground, his knee on the man's throat, his fist coming down again and again and again, with a wet, terrible rhythm. "Boss!" Minho grabbed Andy's shoulder. "Boss, he's down! He's down!" Andy stopped. His chest was heaving, his knuckles split and bloody. Blood spattered his expensive suit, not his blood. He looked up, and his eyes found Celine's, and for a moment she saw past the violence to the terror underneath. Terror that they'd almost taken his son, that he'd almost lost the one thing his empire couldn't replace. Then he saw her expression. Celine was holding Jackie, who'd buried his face in her shoulder, hands over his ears against the sounds of violence. But she was staring at Andy with something between horror and recognition. This was who he really was. Not the father learning to be gentle, but this creature built from violence. This man whose hands dealt death as easily as they reached for his son. The 3 attackers were members of a rival organization, she'd learn later. An attempted kidnapping designed to leverage Andy's known weakness, his child. They'd underestimated both his response time and his brutality. All 3 would survive, but hospitalized with injuries that made headlines. Park's brutal response to kidnapping attempt. Is anyone safe? Celine had nightmares for a week afterward. Nightmares where Andy's hands moved from breaking bones to reaching for Jackie, where violence and tenderness blurred until she couldn't tell them apart. She'd known intellectually what he was, had read the news reports, had understood his world ran on fear and blood. But knowing and seeing were different. Knowing and feeling the spray of someone else's blood were different. She was torn between worlds, trapped between the man who hummed Korean lullabies to his son and the man who'd nearly beaten someone to death in front of her. The media had a field day. Photos of the aftermath, paramedics loading 3 men into ambulances, Andy with blood on his suit, Celine visible in the background holding Jackie, went viral. The narrative shifted. Waitress and child witnessed Park's brutality. Some articles painted her as a victim caught in a gangster's world. Others suggested she was complicit, that her presence somehow enabled or encouraged his violence. Then Minjung struck. Andy's ex-wife, who'd been living her perfect life in Los Angeles for 2 years, suddenly saw opportunity in the chaos. Her lawyer filed emergency custody papers in Seoul Family Court, claiming Andy was an unfit parent. The filing cited his criminal lifestyle, the kidnapping attempt, and most damningly, his inappropriate relationship with service staff being used as unpaid childcare. The custody filing painted Celine as either a victim being exploited or a gold digger targeting a vulnerable single father. It accused Andy of using Jackie to launder his reputation, of employing unlicensed care providers, of exposing his son to violence and instability. The filing included the paparazzi photos, dozens of them, compiled over months, that showed what looked like family intimacy. Celine's hand on Jackie's shoulder, Andy watching her with his son, the three of them leaving restaurants together. The papers arrived at Andy's mansion on a Wednesday morning, delivered with a thick packet of photos and a notice that the custody hearing was scheduled in 10 days. Andy sat in his office, the one where blood had been cleaned from the floor months ago, and read through the filing with hands that didn't shake despite the fury building in his chest. Minho stood nearby, watching his boss with concern. "We can fight this. Our lawyers are better than hers. The judge will see she abandoned Jackie." "She abandoned a diagnosed child," Andy said quietly. "I exposed him to a kidnapping attempt. I'm documented organized crime. She's a concerned mother trying to protect her son from a dangerous environment." He threw the papers across his desk. "She's going to win." That evening, his second-in-command requested a meeting. Young-soo was 10 years older than Andy, had served under his father, represented the old guard's perspective. He sat across from Andy with the careful posture of someone delivering bad news to a dangerous man. "Boss, I need to speak plainly." "Then speak." "She's making you soft." Jung-soo didn't specify which she, he meant. Could have been Celine, could have been Min-jung, could have been the whole situation. "The men are talking. They're saying you've lost your edge, that you're distracted. Weak." "The men can say whatever they want as long as they stay loyal. Loyalty follows strength. Always has." Jung-soo leaned forward. "That kidnapping attempt? That happened because rivals think you're vulnerable now. They see the photos of you with a waitress and a child, and they think the Park Empire is weakening. They're testing you." Andy's voice went cold. 3 men are in the hospital. That's not weak. 3 men got close enough to try. That's the problem. Jung-soo paused. "I'm not saying this to challenge you. I'm saying it because I've served this family for 20 years. Your father would have never allowed personal attachments to become public vulnerabilities." "My father," Andy said slowly, "died alone in a hospital bed because everyone was too afraid of him to sit with him. Is that the legacy you're suggesting I follow?" Jung-soo stood. "I'm suggesting you remember what world we live in. Gentleness is a luxury men like us can't afford." After he left, Andy sat alone in his office, the custody papers spread before him like evidence of every choice he'd made wrong. Outside his windows, Seoul sprawled in the darkness, full of people who lived simpler lives. People who didn't have to choose between being gentle with their children and surviving in a world built on violence. His phone buzzed. A message from Celine. "Jackie asked about you today. He wanted to know when he could see Celine Iyama again." Andy stared at the message for a long time. Then he looked at the custody papers, at the photos of his son looking happier than he'd been in years, at the accusation that he was unfit, unstable, dangerous. They were right about what he was. But they were wrong about what he was trying to become. The storm had gathered. The battle lines were drawn. And Andy Park, who controlled Seoul's underground through fear and violence, who'd survived his father's brutality by becoming harder than stone, who'd built an empire on blood and broken bones, faced a choice that no amount of power or money could solve. He could distance himself from Celine, fight the custody battle alone, prove he could be a father without help. Or he could risk everything: his reputation, his organization's stability, his empire. By admitting he needed someone, by surrendering control in a world where surrender meant death. The hearing was in 10 days, and Andy had no idea which choice would save his son, or if either choice could save him from becoming his father. Andy's legal team assembled in his mansion's conference room like surgeons preparing for a complicated operation. 5 lawyers, 2 paralegals, and a media consultant, all of them expensive enough to make defending murderers look like a reasonable career choice. The lead attorney, a woman named Park Sun-hee, who specialized in family law for Seoul's elite, laid out their strategy with clinical precision. "We need to eliminate all contact with the waitress," she said, pulling up photos on the projection screen. "Every single image they have shows you with her. They're painting a narrative of instability, of using unlicensed care providers, of inappropriate boundaries. We can't fight that narrative if you're still seeing her." Andy sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. "She helps Jackie. That's not relevant to the legal strategy. What's relevant is that your ex-wife's team will argue you're exploiting a vulnerable foreign worker, using her as unpaid childcare while exposing your son to a criminal lifestyle. They'll paint you as either a predator or a fool. Neither looks good to a family court judge." The media consultant, a young man with expensive glasses and anxious energy, pulled up more photos. "The optics are terrible, Mr. Park. Korean media is already running with racial and class angles. Black woman and Korean gangster plays into every prejudice. Rich man exploiting poor server plays into class warfare. Even if your relationship is innocent." "It is innocent," Andy said, his voice flat. "Even so, perception is reality in court. Judge Hanman is conservative, traditional. She'll see these photos and see chaos, instability. She'll see a child caught between a criminal father and a foreign woman of unclear status." The consultant paused. "You need to distance yourself immediately. Make a public statement. Show you're taking appropriate steps." Andy's hands were folded on the table, but his knuckles were white. "What do you suggest? That I abandon the only person who's helped my son in 2 years? The only person who's taught me how to reach him?" Park Sun-hee softened slightly. "I understand this is difficult, but we're talking about keeping custody of Jackie. That's the priority. Everything else is secondary." "She's not secondary to him." "Then you need to ask yourself which matters more, your attachment to this woman or keeping your son." The words hung in the air like an ultimatum. Andy dismissed them all shortly after, their strategies and warnings echoing in the empty conference room after they'd gone. Minho lingered by the door. "Boss, they're not wrong. Legally, they're giving you the path to win." "I know." Andy stood and walked to the windows. Outside, Jackie was in the garden with one of the bodyguards, tracing patterns in the gravel path. The boy was getting worse again. More rocking, more self-isolation, more retreat. Without Selini's consistent presence, he was sliding backward. "But that path means losing what I'm trying to save." "You'll still have him. That's what matters." "Will I? If I win custody by abandoning the one person who taught me how to be his father? If I choose my empire over his healing?" Andy's reflection stared back at him from the window. "Then I'm just keeping him, not reaching him. I'm just my father with better lawyers." Meanwhile, across the city, Celine's world was collapsing in slow motion. The media circus had intensified after the custody filing became public. Reporters camped outside her apartment building. She had to use the back fire escape to avoid them. Her phone rang constantly with numbers she didn't recognize. The voicemails ranged from interview requests to death threats. The racist attacks online had evolved into real-world harassment. Someone had posted her address on a forum. She'd found racist graffiti on her apartment door twice. A group of women confronted her at the bus stop, calling her things in Korean that she pretended not to understand while her hands shook. Then, immigration authorities called. Not a letter this time, but a direct phone call requesting she come to their office immediately to clarify some questions about her visa status. The timing was too convenient to be coincidence. Someone with power had made a call, had decided a black woman with precarious immigration status was an easy target to eliminate from the equation. Celine sat in her apartment, curtains drawn against the paparazzi cameras, and felt the walls closing in. She'd survived the collapse of the Seoul Special Needs Alliance, had survived 4 years of invisible labor, of swallowing her expertise and pride, had survived being erased once, But this was different. This was targeted, personal, and she was terrified. Her phone buzzed. A message from Andy. "I need to see you." She didn't respond. What could she say? That being associated with him was destroying what little stability she'd built? That her visa status was suddenly in question? That she was receiving death threats because tabloids had decided she was either his victim or his accomplice? But then another message came through, this one from a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Francis, this is Jackie's specialist, Dr. Kim. I wanted you to know that Jackie has regressed significantly in the past week. He's stopped eating again. He's self-harming, banging his head, hitting himself. Mr. Park is beside himself. I know you're dealing with a lot right now, but if there's anything you can do..." Celine stared at the message until the words blurred. Jackie was hurting, was sliding back into that unreachable place where the world was too loud, too bright, too much. And she was hiding in her apartment while he suffered, while the one connection that had helped him was severed by legal strategy and public opinion. She looked around her studio apartment, all 200 square feet of it, everything she'd managed to build in 4 years of invisible survival. Looked at the drawer where her PhD certificate was hidden, looked at the person she'd become, small, silent, erased. And something inside her broke. Or maybe it was something that finally refused to stay broken. She picked up her phone and texted Andy. Where? They met at a cafe in Itaewon, the neighborhood diverse enough that a black woman and a Korean man drew fewer stares. Andy arrived with only Minho, the bodyguard waiting outside while they sat in a back corner booth. He looked terrible. Hadn't shaved in days, his expensive suit wrinkled. The controlled violence that usually defined him replaced by something raw and desperate. "Jackie's stopped eating," he said without preamble. "He's hurting himself. The specialists can't reach him. I can't reach him." His hands were shaking slightly on the table. "He asks for you. Every day. Celine Ioma, when Celine Ioma." And I don't know what to tell him. Celine wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, needing something to hold. "Your lawyers think I'm the problem, that I'm making you look unstable. My lawyers think control and image matter more than actually being a father. Maybe they're right. Maybe you need to distance yourself from me to win custody. I've spent my whole life building distance, building walls, controlling everything through fear and violence." Andy leaned forward. "And it got me an empire I don't care about, and a son I couldn't reach. You taught me how to tear those walls down, how to surrender control, how to actually see him." His voice cracked. "How to love him in a way he can feel. And now that's being used against you. Let it be used. I don't care what the tabloids say or what the lawyers think or what it costs me. I care about Jackie, and Jackie needs you." Celine felt tears burning behind her eyes. "It's not that simple. Immigration is questioning my visa. I'm getting death threats. People have posted my address online. Her voice broke. "I'm terrified, Andy, and I don't know if I'm strong enough for what you're asking. I'm not asking you to be strong. I'm asking you to be there. For him. For us." He paused. "The custody hearing is in 3 days. My lawyers want me to distance myself from you, but Min Jung's lawyers are going to destroy me anyway. They'll paint me as an unfit father because they're not wrong. I am dangerous. I have exposed Jackie to violence. My world is exactly as unstable as they'll claim." "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying the only defense I have is the truth. That I'm trying to change, that I'm learning to be the father Jackie needs, and you're the one teaching me, that maybe love and connection matter more than image and control." He met her eyes. "I need you to testify. I need you to tell them who you really are, what you really know, why Jackie calls you Iama." Celine's heart was pounding. "You have any idea what you're asking? They'll destroy me on that stand. They'll question my credentials, my visa status, my intentions. They'll paint me as either your victim or your accomplice. They'll make sure I can never work in education again." "I know." Andy's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I know what it'll cost you. I know what I've already cost you. But Jackie needs the truth. I need the truth. I've already lost everything once, Selene said, her voice shaking. I built a life here, built programs that helped hundreds of children, and it was all destroyed by... She stopped, the connection clicking in her mind even though she'd been avoiding it. By charity fraud investigations, by organizations that used nonprofits as money laundering fronts. She watched Andy's face change as he processed what she wasn't quite saying. Watched him understand that there might be connections neither of them had wanted to see. What was the name of your program? He asked slowly. Soul Special Needs Alliance. We lost funding 4 years ago when... Park Enterprises. Andy's voice was hollow. My organization laundered money through your program. We destroyed your funding. The silence between them was vast and terrible. All the pieces falling into place. Why she'd lost everything. Why Jackie couldn't access the services he needed. Why the one person who could help him was serving tables instead of directing programs. You destroyed my life's work, Selene said quietly. You used the charity that helped 200 children as a front for your criminal empire. And when it collapsed, those children lost everything. I lost everything. I didn't know, Andy said, but the excuse sounded hollow even to him. I signed papers. I didn't read what they were for. You didn't care, because they were just numbers to you. Just covers. Just tools for your empire. Selene stood up, her chair scraping loud against the floor. And now you want me to help you? To testify for you? To save your custody case when your organization destroyed the very programs your son needed? Yes. Andy stood too, his voice raw. Yes. I'm asking you to help me even though I don't deserve it, even though my empire destroyed yours. Because Jackie deserves it. He deserves to have someone who sees him truly, someone who knows how to reach him. And that's you. Selene stared at him, this man who'd unknowingly destroyed her life and then asked her to save his. This man who was learning to be gentle despite every instinct screaming for violence. This man whose son called her Iama with more love than he'd ever had from his biological mother. If I do this, she said slowly, if I testify, they'll destroy me. Completely. Any chance of rebuilding my career, of staying in Korea, of having any kind of future, it'll all be gone. I know. So why should I? Why should I sacrifice everything for you? Andy was quiet for a long moment. Then, you shouldn't. I have no right to ask. But Jackie deserves someone who'll fight for him even when it's costly. Even when it's unfair. Even when the person asking doesn't deserve the help. He paused. That's what love looks like, isn't it? What you taught me. Love that doesn't count the cost. Selene felt something break open in her chest. She thought about Jackie's smile when he saw her. Thought about his small hand in hers. His voice saying, Selene Iyama. With trust she hadn't earned except by showing up. Thought about 8 years of helping children society wanted to ignore, and 4 years of that expertise dying unused while she carried plates. She thought about who she'd been before the world tried to erase her, and who she could choose to be despite everything it had cost. 3 days, she said finally. The hearing's in 3 days? Yes. Then I need 2 days to prepare. I need every document about my credentials, about the Soul Special Needs Alliance, about what your organization did to it. I need proof of everything. Andy nodded slowly. You'll do it? I'll testify, Selene said. Not for you, for Jackie, for every child whose programs your empire destroyed, for the 8 years I spent believing education could change the world. She grabbed her coat. And when this is over, when the judge rules and the media moves on to the next scandal, you're going to fund a new program. You're going to restore what you destroyed. That's the cost. Done. I'm not finished. Selene's voice was steel wrapped in exhaustion. You're also going to testify. You're going to stand in that courtroom and admit what your organization did. Admit that you destroyed the very services your son needed. Admit that your empire has costs, and one of those costs was my life's work and 200 children's support systems. That'll destroy my custody case. Maybe. Or maybe it'll show you're capable of taking responsibility, of choosing truth over image. She met his eyes. You said you wanted to change. Prove it. Andy Park, who'd spent 20 years building an empire on violence and control, who'd survived by never showing weakness, who'd learned from his father that surrender meant death, nodded. Okay, he said simply. I'll tell the truth. Selene left the cafe and walked out into Seoul's winter afternoon. The paparazzi cameras would be waiting at her apartment. The death threats would keep coming. Immigration authorities would keep questioning her status. And in 3 days, she'd walk into a courtroom and voluntarily destroy any chance she had of rebuilding her life quietly. But Jackie would have his voice heard. The truth would be spoken. And maybe, just maybe, something new could grow from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Sometimes the most terrifying thing we can do is choose to be seen, to step out of survival mode and into the full light of truth, knowing it might burn us but trusting that some things are worth the fire. Selene had been erased once. This time, she would make sure everyone remembered her name. Seoul Family Court looked like a fortress under siege. International media crews lined the steps 3 deep, satellite trucks blocking traffic on the narrow street. Inside, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder in the gallery. Cameras positioned at every legal angle. The air thick with anticipation, and the particular electricity that comes from watching powerful people bleed in public. Minjung arrived like royalty returning from exile. Her designer hanbok was traditional yet modern, soft pink silk embroidered with cranes, symbols of maternal devotion and longevity. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, her makeup subtle and perfect. She looked exactly like what she was selling, the concerned Korean mother forced to rescue her son from a criminal father and foreign corruption. The cameras loved her. She paused on the courthouse steps just long enough for the perfect photo, her expression artfully mixing sorrow and determination. Andy sat at the defendant's table in a dark suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, but couldn't hide what he was. His tattoos crept above his collar despite his lawyer's desperate instructions to cover them. Minho and another bodyguard sat in the front row behind him, their presence a reminder of the world he came from even in this temple of civilian justice. He kept his hands folded on the table, his expression blank. But Selene could see the tension in his shoulders from where she sat in the back, hidden among the crowd of observers. Judge Han Min entered, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the severe expression of someone who'd seen every variation of human failure and wasn't impressed by any of them. The bailiff called the court to order. Min Jung's attorney stood, a sharp-featured man named Kwon, who specialized in high-profile family cases and knew exactly how to play to the cameras. Your Honor, this case is straightforward, Kwon began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone used to winning. A mother seeks to protect her son from a father whose criminal lifestyle poses clear and present danger. Mr. Park's organization is under investigation for money laundering, drug trafficking, and racketeering. His own son witnessed an attempted kidnapping that resulted in 3 men being hospitalized by Mr. Park's violent response. He paused, letting that image settle. But perhaps most concerning is Mr. Park's inappropriate relationship with a foreign service worker whom he has positioned as a surrogate mother figure, a woman with no legal standing, no verified credentials, whose immigration status is currently under review. The word foreign landed like he intended it to, a dog whistle wrapped in legal language. Selene felt the stares turn toward her, felt herself becoming a symbol rather than a person. The black waitress, the opportunist, the threat. Kwon continued, building his narrative with surgical precision. He presented evidence of Andy's criminal associations, photos from the kidnapping aftermath, testimony from Jackie's previous specialists about the unstable home environment. Then he called Min Jung to the stand. She testified with the perfect balance of regret and maternal concern. Yes, she'd left the marriage, but only because Mr. Park's lifestyle made it impossible to provide a safe environment for Jackie. Yes, she'd been overwhelmed by the diagnosis initially. What mother wouldn't be? But she'd spent 2 years in Los Angeles getting her own therapy, preparing herself to be the mother Jackie deserved. She'd built a stable life, a safe home, far from Seoul's criminal underworld. She cried at exactly the right moments, her voice breaking when she described how she'd failed Jackie by leaving, but couldn't fail him again by letting him remain in danger. The performance was flawless. Even knowing it was a performance, Selene felt its power. Minjung wasn't wrong about Andy's world being dangerous, wasn't wrong that his lifestyle posed risks. She was just wrong about caring enough to face those risks instead of running from them. Then Kwon called Selene to the stand. She walked through the courtroom with her head high, past the cameras and whispers and judgment that pressed against her like physical weight. She'd chosen a simple black dress, professional but not expensive, her natural hair pulled back. She'd decided that morning not to play the part they wanted her to play, neither the grateful servant nor the seductive interloper. She would just be herself, and let them make of it what they would. Kwon began gently, establishing basic facts: her name, her current employment, how long she'd known the Park family. Then the blade came out. "Ms. Francis, you work as a waitress at Hanul Restaurant, correct?" "Yes." "And Mr. Park began requesting your service specifically how many months ago?" 3 months. "During this time, you formed what you would describe as a close relationship with his son?" "I've helped Jackie, yes." "Helped him how? Are you a licensed childcare provider in Korea?" "No." "Are you a licensed therapist? Occupational therapist? Any kind of medical professional?" "No." "So you're an unlicensed foreign worker who has positioned herself as a surrogate mother figure to a vulnerable child." Kwon let that hang. "Tell me, Ms. Francis, what is your immigration status?" Park Sun-hee objected, relevance, but Judge Han-min allowed it. Selene answered clearly. "I'm here on a work visa sponsored by my employer." "The restaurant, where you serve tables." Kwon's tone made it sound like a crime. "Before that, what did you do?" "I had various positions." "Various positions. Interesting." He pulled up documents on the screen. "According to immigration records, you've been in Korea for 12 years, but your current visa is only 4 years old. What happened to your previous visa?" Celine's hands were steady on the stand. "My previous employment ended. I had to find new sponsorship." "Your previous employment at the Seoul Special Needs Alliance, which was shut down due to fraud investigations." Kwon let the word fraud echo. "Were you involved in that fraud, Ms. Francis?" "No. The investigation cleared all staff members." "But you lost your position, lost your visa status, went from directing programs to serving tables." He moved closer. "That must have been difficult, humiliating even. And then, you meet Mr. Park, a wealthy single father, clearly desperate for help with his son. Tell me, Ms. Francis, did you target him specifically? See an opportunity?" Andy started to rise from his seat, but Park Sun-hee grabbed his arm. Selene felt the rage building in her chest, felt the familiar weight of having to defend her existence, her intentions, her humanity to people who'd already decided she was guilty of the crime of being both black and poor. "I didn't target anyone," she said, her voice level. "I was assigned to their table." "And yet, you formed an unusually close bond very quickly. The child calls you mother in Korean. You've been photographed with the family in ways that suggest intimacy beyond professional service." Kwon's voice dropped, insinuating. "Isn't it true that you saw a vulnerable single father with money and inserted yourself into his life? That your so-called help with Jackie was simply a way to secure financial security for yourself?" The courtroom was silent, waiting for her to break or defend or cry. Selene looked at Kwon, at this man who'd reduced her expertise and her love to gold digging, who'd weaponized her race and her poverty and her immigration status into proof of criminal intent. She looked at Min Jung, sitting primly in her designer hanbok, playing the mother she'd never been. She looked at Andy, whose hands were clenched on the table, whose eyes held an apology that couldn't undo the questions she was enduring. Then she looked at Judge Hanmin and began to speak. "My name is Selene Francis." Her voice was clear, strong, carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "I have a master's degree in special education from Seoul National University and completed PhD coursework at Columbia University. For 8 years, I served as director of the Seoul Special Needs Alliance, where I helped over 200 children with autism, ADHD, and developmental delays learn to communicate, thrive, and believe they belonged in this world." The courtroom went absolutely silent. Kwan's expression flickered. Confusion, then comprehension, then barely concealed panic. Selene continued, her voice steady and inexorable. "I didn't lose my position because of incompetence or fraud. I lost it because the organization that destroyed our funding was Park Enterprises. Mr. Park's money laundering operation used our charity as a front, and when authorities investigated, everything collapsed. 200 children lost their services overnight. Families who depended on our programs were left with nothing. I lost my career, my visa status, my life's work." She turned to look directly at Andy, holding his gaze. His criminal empire eliminated the very services his son desperately needed. While I was developing programs that could have helped Jackie thrive, Mr. Park was signing papers that would destroy those programs. The irony is perfect and devastating. Then she turned to Min Jung, and her voice took on an edge sharp enough to cut. "You want to know why Jackie calls me Selena Iyama? Because I'm the first person in his life who saw him as whole, not broken. Not because I was paid. I make minimum wage serving tables. Not because I was obligated. I have no legal connection to your family. Not because it made me look good, as this hearing proves. It's done the opposite. But because that's what love looks like when it's real, even when the world tries to erase both of you." Her voice rose, controlled power flowing through every word. "You abandoned your son when he needed you most because he wasn't convenient to your image, because a child with autism didn't fit the perfect life you wanted to project. And Mr. Park built an empire of violence while destroying the very systems that could have helped Jackie communicate, connect, and feel safe in this world. I'm not perfect. I'm not a savior. I'm just someone who refused to stop seeing him, refused to look away from a child who needed someone to speak his language." The courtroom erupted. Reporters were scrambling, cameras flashing, Judge Hanmin pounding her gavel for order. Min Jung's composure shattered completely, her perfect maternal mask cracking to reveal the fury and humiliation beneath. Kwan was objecting, his strategy in ruins, but his voice was lost in the chaos. And Andy Park, who'd survived 20 years in Seoul's criminal underworld through violence and control, who'd built an empire on other men's fear, who'd learned from his father that tears were weakness and emotion was death. Andy's armor broke completely. Tears streamed down his face, visible to everyone, to the cameras and reporters and judge and jury of public opinion. His shoulders shook with the weight of everything he'd destroyed trying to build safety, everything he'd lost while thinking he was gaining power. Selene stepped down from the stand and walked back to her seat through the chaos, carrying herself with the dignity of someone who'd finally refused to be invisible. She'd destroyed any chance of rebuilding her life quietly, had exposed herself to judgment and deportation and public scrutiny, had voluntarily given up every protection silence had provided. But the truth was spoken. Jackie's voice was heard. And sometimes that's all love can do. Speak truth, even when it costs everything, and trust that something true is worth more than something safe. You just lived this whole story with me, every heartbreak, every redemption. I gave you a piece of my soul in this one, so now I'm asking for 2 seconds. Subscribe. Don't take all this emotion and vanish. Be the kind of person who gives back. Judge Hanman's ruling came swift and conditional, delivered in the flat tone of someone who'd heard enough drama for one day. Jackie would remain with Andy Park, but the requirements were strict and non-negotiable. Comprehensive family therapy with a licensed specialist, verified legitimate income sources documented quarterly, a professional support plan reviewed by the court every 6 months, and regular monitoring by child services. Any violence, any criminal charges, any indication of unstable environment would mean immediate custody transfer. Andy had won, but on the thinnest of margins, his victory wrapped in so many conditions it felt more like probation than parenthood. Outside on the courthouse steps, January's soul bit down hard. The sky was that particular winter gray that turns the whole city monochrome, and the cold sliced through expensive coats like they were paper. Andy's bodyguards formed a human wall against the media crush. Reporters shouting questions in Korean and English, cameras flashing like small explosions, the feeding frenzy that comes from watching powerful people bleed in public finally reaching its peak. Andy found Selene sitting alone on a bench to the side of the courthouse, away from the chaos but not hidden from it. She looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. The kind of exhaustion that comes from stripping yourself bare in front of strangers and knowing they've seen every scar, every wound, every part of you that you'd kept protected for survival. Her hands were shaking slightly, though whether from cold or adrenaline crash, he couldn't tell. He sat beside her, and Minho signaled the other guards to give them space, to form their protective perimeter at a respectful distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just sat there while Seoul moved around them, indifferent to their small drama in its vast sprawl. "You were right about everything," Andy said finally, his voice rough from the tears he'd cried in court, from the armor that had cracked so completely it might never fully rebuild. "I destroyed your life building mine, made my son's world smaller, trying to make mine bigger. Chose violence because I thought it meant strength. Thought control meant protection." He paused, staring at his hands, tattooed, scarred, hands that had built an empire and broken bones and signed papers that destroyed programs without reading what they were for. "I don't know if I can become the man Jackie needs. I don't know if I can leave this life I've built my identity on. My organization, my empire, it's not just what I do, it's who I've been for 20 years. But I want to try. For him. Maybe." His voice dropped. "Maybe for the first time, for me too." Selene studied him. This man whose organization had destroyed her work, who'd learned gentleness for his son despite every instinct trained for brutality, who'd just cried in public for the first time in decades. "Your apology doesn't give me back 8 years," she said quietly. "Doesn't bring back those 200 children who lost their services. Doesn't undo the violence you've built your empire on, the lives your organization has damaged or destroyed. But it's a start." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow that hadn't fallen yet. Andy pulled an envelope from his jacket, official-looking, thick with documents. "Director of the Park Foundation for Neurodevelopmental Support," he said, handing it to her. "Funded by the legitimate portions of my fortune, and I'll work to make more of it legitimate. Full autonomy, unlimited resources, your vision, your leadership, your staff, your programs, your decisions. You build what I destroyed." Selene took the envelope but didn't open it, her fingers tracing its edges. "Why? Guilt?" "Partly," Andy admitted. "Mostly because you were right in that courtroom. I can't undo what I did. Can't bring back the 8 years you lost or restore those programs I destroyed. But maybe I can stop being the problem and start being part of the answer. Because Jackie isn't the only child like him. And you're not the only person who had their life's work destroyed by people like me." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let me help fix what I broke, even if I can never fully repair it." Selene was quiet for a long time, watching the city move around them, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. Finally, "I'll take it. But not because you're sorry. Because those children still need advocates. And I spent 4 years watching my expertise die unused, while I carried plates for people who never saw me. She opened the envelope, scanning the documents. Incorporation papers, bank statements, building leases. It was real. Substantial. But you need to understand something. This doesn't make us even. This doesn't erase what your empire did. It's just you choosing to stop causing harm and start causing something else. I understand. They sat in silence for another moment. Two people who'd been erased by different systems. Her by poverty and racism and immigration vulnerability. Him by violence and control and the armor he'd built to survive his father's brutality. Both of them learning in this moment what it meant to be seen truly. That evening, as Seoul's winter dusk turned the city blue and gold, Selene stood in Andy's penthouse apartment for the first time. 48 floors above the streets, glass walls showing the city sprawling below like a living map of all the lives that moved through it, unaware of the small revolution happening in this space. The guards waited outside in the hallway, respectful of whatever was unfolding here. Jackie was waiting for her in the living room, and when he saw her, he ran, actually ran, something he rarely did, and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Celine Iyama, you came back." His voice was stronger than it had been 3 months ago, his body less rigid, his eyes making contact for longer moments. "I came back," she said, kneeling to meet him at eye level, her hands gentle on his shoulders. "I'll always come back." She spent the next hour teaching Andy in his private space, showing him techniques she'd developed over 8 years of helping children like Jackie. How to hum gently when he felt overwhelmed, matching the rhythm to his rocking instead of trying to stop it. How to approach patiently from the side, entering his peripheral vision before his direct line of sight. How to see his patterns as language, not chaos. The way he arranged his toys in specific configurations, traced invisible shapes on surfaces, kneaded things in particular orders that made sense to him even if they looked random to everyone else. Jackie ate dinner from both their hands, relaxed and trusting in a way that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. Andy watched his son with an expression caught between wonder and grief. Grief for all the time he'd lost to not knowing how to reach him, wonder that it was possible at all. After Jackie was settled with his favorite tablet, headphones on, absorbed in patterns only he could see, Andy removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. The tattoos covered both arms completely, dragons and tigers in traditional Korean style, symbols of power and protection that marked him as belonging to a world that solved problems through violence. They were beautiful in their way, intricate and meaningful, but they were also a uniform he could never fully remove. He knelt beside his son at eye level, the way Celine had taught him. And for the first time in 2 decades, tears fell freely down his face. Not the breaking that had happened in the courtroom, but something quieter, more private. Grief and gratitude mixing until they couldn't be separated. "You didn't just give me my son back," he said, looking up at Celine. "You showed me who I could choose to become." Celine's hand found his across the table where Jackie's dinner plate sat empty for the first time in weeks. "No," she said firmly. "You finally chose to stop hiding behind the armor. That's all you. I just showed you what was already there, waiting." She paused, her grip tightening. "Now comes the hard part, choosing it every day. When your organization questions your weakness, when rivals test you, when being gentle feels like dying because violence is all you've known. You have to choose this version of yourself over and over. Will you help me with that?" "I'll help Jackie. I'll build the programs you're funding. I'll teach other parents what I taught you." Celine's voice was steady. "But the choosing, that's yours alone. I can't do it for you." They sat together while the city lights flickered on below them, while Jackie hummed softly to himself in his own world that was slowly, carefully, opening to include them. 2 people learning what it meant to build something instead of destroying it. To choose vulnerability instead of armor. To believe that maybe, just maybe, Love was stronger than fear when you gave it room to breathe. Outside, Seoul moved through its evening rhythms, indifferent to the small miracle happening 48 floors above its streets. But inside that apartment, in the space between what had been destroyed and what could be built from the ruins, redemption was beginning. Not complete. Not easy. Not guaranteed. Just beginning, with all the uncertain hope that comes from taking the first step toward becoming someone new. 6 months later, the Park Foundation for Neurodevelopmental Support opened its doors in a renovated building in Gangnam, 3 blocks from where the Seoul Special Needs Alliance had once stood. The architecture was modern, all glass and light and open spaces, the complete opposite of Andy's criminal empire aesthetic of shadows and closed doors. The entrance was accessible, the classrooms bright, every surface chosen for comfort rather than intimidation. It looked like hope made physical, like someone had taken 8 years of destroyed dreams and rebuilt them with better materials. Selene stood in the main classroom surrounded by 20 children ranging from 5 to 14 years old. Korean kids, international kids, mixed-race kids who belonged to multiple worlds or none, all of them neurodivergent, all of them thriving in ways their previous schools had said was impossible. Laughter filled the space like music, bouncing off walls painted in soft colors that didn't assault sensitive eyes. Her team included 5 former Seoul Special Needs Alliance staff members she'd tracked down and reunited. Ji-won, now a senior therapist. Min Seo, who'd lost her career the same day Celine did. Others who'd spent years having their expertise ignored because one investigation had tainted them all. It was Tuesday afternoon, which meant Andy's weekly visit with Jackie. Celine heard them arrive before she saw them. Jackie's voice calling out greetings to children he'd come to know, Andy's deeper tones responding to staff who'd learned he was more than the headlines suggested. No bodyguards inside the building. That had been Celine's non-negotiable condition. 2 waited respectfully in the car outside, but inside the foundation, violence stayed at the door. Jackie ran to join a group working on an art project, his movements more fluid now, less rigid with anxiety. He'd made friends here. Other children who understood what it meant to experience the world differently, who didn't judge his patterns or his need for specific routines. He belonged here in a way he'd never belonged anywhere else. Andy stood in the doorway watching his son, and Selene noticed the changes in him too. He'd stepped back from most criminal operations over the past 6 months, working with authorities on a careful, protected exit strategy that was dangerous but necessary. Building legitimate businesses, cleaning money in reverse, trying to untangle 20 years of empire from the underworld's grip. The process was slow, costly, and some nights he came to the foundation looking like he'd aged a decade. But he kept coming, kept choosing. Celine walked over to him, wiping paint from her hands onto her jeans. "He did really well in group therapy this morning," she said. Participated in the conversation circle without prompting. Even made eye contact with 2 other kids. "That's good." Andy's voice carried exhaustion but also something else. Satisfaction maybe, or the beginning of peace. "That's really good." They walked together to Celine's office, a small space with windows overlooking the street. A plaque hung on the wall in Korean and English. "In memory of all the children we forgot to see, and in honor of those who saw them anyway. May we all learn to choose seeing." Below it, in a simple frame, hung Celine's first legitimate paycheck in 4 years, memo line in Andy's handwriting. "For services rendered with profound gratitude, and for teaching me what strength really means." She'd kept it as a reminder, not of his redemption, which was ongoing and incomplete, but of her own journey from director to waitress to director again. Of the fact that expertise didn't disappear just because the world stopped valuing it. Of the stubborn truth that some people refuse to be erased, no matter how hard the systems work to make them invisible. "How are things?" she asked, pouring them both tea from the pot she kept warm on her desk. Andy sat heavily in the chair across from her. "Hard. My second-in-command is pushing back against the exit strategy, says I'm making the organization vulnerable to takeover, which is true. 2 of my legitimate businesses are struggling because I don't actually know how to run companies without using them as fronts. He rubbed his face. And Minjung is filing appeals, still claiming I'm unfit, that the foundation is just another criminal front with better publicity. Is she right about that last part? No. Andy met her eyes. This is the only thing I've built in 20 years that isn't about control or violence or profit. It's about Jackie, and about every other child like him who needs someone to learn their language. Celine sipped her tea, studying him. He looked tired but present in a way he hadn't been 6 months ago. The armor hadn't fully come down. Probably never would, given the world he still partially inhabited. But it was thinner now, more flexible. You hummed to him yesterday, she said, when he was getting overwhelmed before the session started. I saw you humming Half Moon in that minor key, matching his rocking. You did it without thinking about it. Andy nodded slowly. It's becoming automatic, like the violence used to be. That's growth. That's you choosing a different automatic response. She set down her tea. But you know this isn't over, right? The exit strategy, the legitimization, the transformation, it's a process that might take years. And some parts of what you've done can never be undone. I know. His voice was quiet. I'm not looking for redemption, just a different direction. A way to be Jackie's father that doesn't require him to live in the world I built from violence. Through the window, they could see Jackie playing with the other children, his laughter mixing with theirs in a sound that 6 months ago would have seemed impossible. Real transformation, Celine had learned, didn't live in grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It lived in smaller moments, repeated daily, building into something larger than their individual components. Later, as the afternoon session was ending and parents arrived to collect their children, Selena watched Andy kneel beside Jackie at eye level. The boy was showing him a drawing, 3 figures holding hands under a sky filled with both stars and Korean characters spelling out Bayol. Stars. His voice was clear and strong as he pointed to each figure. Selene Iyama, Appa, Jackie, Uri Gejok. Our family. Andy's hands, tattooed, scarred, hands that had dealt violence for 20 years, were gentle as they held the drawing, patient as they traced the shapes Jackie had made, present in a way that required him to surrender the control that had once defined him. Uri Gejok, he repeated softly, our family. Celine smiled from across the room, surrounded by children who would never be invisible again, by staff who'd had their expertise restored, by programs rebuilt with better foundations than before. She'd learned something profound in her journey from director to waitress to director again. Sometimes the person you fear most is the one holding the mirror to everything you've been running from. Sometimes the most dangerous man in the city is also the most lost. Sometimes love means choosing to see someone truly, even when they've given you every reason to look away. She hadn't been hired to change their lives, hadn't planned to save anyone. She'd just refused to look away from either of them, the child everyone said was broken, and the man everyone said was beyond redemption. And in that refusal, in that stubborn insistence on seeing truly despite everything it cost her, she'd saved more than one gangster's son. She'd held up a mirror to a man's soul and shown him he could choose differently. The late afternoon Seoul winter light filtered through tall windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The city sprawled below, the world they were slowly changing, one child at a time, one choice at a time. One moment of refusing to look away at a time. Jackie handed the drawing to his father, who carefully folded it and tucked it into his jacket pocket, right over his heart where the tattoos marked him as belonging to a world he was learning to leave behind. Can we come back tomorrow? Jackie asked, his eyes darting between his father and Celine with hope that no longer felt fragile. Thursday, Andy said gently. We come on Tuesdays and Thursdays, remember? Thursday, Jackie repeated, testing the word, accepting the boundary. learning that structure didn't have to mean control, that limits could feel safe instead of suffocating. They left together, Andy's hand on Jackie's shoulder, Jackie's hand reaching up to hold his father's with trust that had been earned through consistency and gentleness and the daily choice to be vulnerable. Celine watched them go, then turned back to her classroom where tomorrow 20 children would return, where next week 30 more would join them from the waiting list, where the work of restoration continued one patient moment at a time. Sometimes the person you fear is the one holding the mirror to everything you've been running from. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to look in that mirror instead of breaking it, you find not just what you've destroyed, but what you could become. Not redemption. Redemption was too simple a word for the complicated work of transformation. Just direction. Just choice. Just the daily practice of becoming someone new while carrying everything you've been. The foundation's light stayed on late into the evening, warm against Seoul's winter darkness, a beacon for all the overlooked children and their desperate parents, for all the people who'd been told their children were broken when they were just speaking a language the world hadn't learned yet. And inside, surrounded by laughter and learning and the stubborn hope that comes from refusing to be erased, Celine Francis, waitress, director, survivor, teacher, continued the work of building what love looks like when it's real.